Hello, and welcome to day 2 of 28 Days to Better Chess Tactics. Day 2 is knight forks. Now, forks are special, and because they're like pins where they're very common, but there's pretty much two types of forks. There's knight forks and then all the other types of forks. Now, what makes knight forks particularly unique is just because of how the knight moves, and there's really nothing too complicated about it. It's just recognizing when the knight can hit two pieces at once. So this initial position, just as an example, it's black to move, and I'll just give you a second if you want to look through it. All right, so in this position, it's actually combining two motifs with a pin on the rook here. Now, because the black queen is pinning the rook, this square is undefended, and so the black knight can come in and check, and now the king is forced to move, and we win the white queen. So if you were to deconstruct this position, knight forks become kind of a almost subconscious skill eventually, where if you've practiced them enough, you'll just notice when you can use one. But when it's a complicated position, which this is a simple example, but there are a lot of pieces moving about. For example, the white bishop's here, and we have our own bishop attacking this pawn. So the thought process you'd use, as in pins, is to look for all the checks, captures, and threats. Now, if your strategic understanding is correct, and you know that piece activity is the most important idea, what you want to look for is you want to divide the board, especially when you're attacking, and you want to find all the moves forward that cause a check, a capture, or a threat. So, for example, moving the black rook here, that's a candidate move, because you're ganging up on this pin piece. So you'd want to look for that move as well. You could take the pawn, win a pawn, and pretty much there's no move with the queen because it's staying in a pin here. And then you'll look at the knight. So you'll go in the order of the queen, the rook, the bishop, and then the knight. And of course you'll notice that with the knight you have a check on this square, and pretty much your calculation will just be ensuring that it works. And it does because of the pin. Alright, so now we'll move on to 5 knight fork positions that you can use to practice. In position 1, it is white to move, and we are looking at kind of an obvious example, but I'll just remind you before I give you a minute to solve this position here, you can divide the board, and you can look for all the candidate moves, starting with the king, queen, rook, knight, and then you can check out the pawns. And what you're doing is you're looking, you can use your understanding of activity, where you want to basically attack the opponent's position by looking for all the checks, captures, and threats. And you want to do it in that order, and then you'll calculate to the end of the line. You can set up the position and move the pieces, or you could simply just visualize it, which is good practice. But when you're starting out, especially if you're a beginner, it does help to move the pieces. But I'll give you a minute here, or just a second, and it's white to move. Okay, so in this position, you can see right away that there is a knight fork on c7, and it's kind of a royal family fork, as they call it, because it's hitting the two rooks and then the queen as well as the king. And this is a common motif you'll see, just because of the fact that the rook and the king are on those starting positions. And of course, you know, it's due to an oversight, just missing that there's a fork, but it does happen quite often. There's really no other candidate moves. The queen could come in here and hit this pawn, but he can easily defend against the queen taking on g7, and there's really no other candidate moves, so the knight fork is quite simple to see. But of course, you want to practice your ability to spot knight forks because it is a subconscious skill. Alright, we're going to move on to position 2. Alright, you know the drill at this point. You want to divide the board in half. You want to find all the candidate moves, looking at your king, your queen, rook, bishop, knight, and then pawns. Find all the checks, captures, and threats, and analyze the line until the end to find the strongest one. Alright, it's white to move, so go ahead. Alright, so in this position, you could see that there's multiple contact between the pieces. The bishop's here, the knight looks like it's coming into these squares, and we have opportunities to basically own this file with our rook. So if we look at the queen, we can see that there's really no forcing moves yet. With the king, there's absolutely nothing. So with the rook, then of course we could bring it in, but that's not really forcing, doesn't really threaten anything. So we're left with our bishops and knights. So it looks like black is threatening to take this bishop, but of course it's triple defended, or double defended here in this case. So we wouldn't lose it, and the knight is hitting this pawn, so we could take it, but not right this second because black would simply take our bishop. So we also have a check here. We could see that if we just trade, it stays equal, but we can see that if we check here, combined with the previous motif of pins, this bishop can't take. So if the bishop took, then we'll win the queen. So that doesn't work. But if the king moves here, then we win this stray bishop over here. Now you would think that black could take the bishop, but that doesn't work because the knight was hitting the queen. So he just lost his queen for a piece in that line. So what he has to do is he has to move it, and we can basically get our knight out by taking the bishop here, and though black can sacrifice temporarily and get a piece for, or get a pawn for a piece, we're basically up a piece for a pawn here. So at the end of this line, you should have seen all the way to the end of this part and evaluated it that you're up a piece. So the knight fork in this position came about because you could see that black's king is sitting in the center, which violates one of the opening principles of basically castling your king for safety as well as activating the rook. Alright, so I hope that was a thorough enough explanation for position 2. We'll be moving on to position 3. In position 3, it is white to move here, and you want to divide the board and look for all the candidate moves, and you'll basically want to find all the forcing checks, captures, and threats. So pause the video now and go through the process to determine the best move. Alright, so in this position, you can see that basically black has weak dark squares, which allow a knight fork because without the queen, there's nothing defending these squares. So that's definitely an element in this position. And what you want to do is, you could see the king, there's no candidate moves. Quickly go through the queen. There's basically two candidate moves where you could take the bishop, which might seem ridiculous at first, or you could move here and threaten the pawn. Other than that, there's no candidate moves. The rook, you could bring either rook to bear down on this bishop, but black could simply move the bishop out of the way and the queen's defended, and it would just result in a trade. With the bishop, there's really no forcing moves, and so that leaves us with just the pawns, which there's really nothing, and the knight has a check here. Or he could move back and hit the bishop, but the bishop could just trade. So we want to look at our candidates here. So a forcing move would be for the queen to take, and if we analyze, we could see that the only other move would be for black to take, which leaves us with a knight fork. And so at the end of this line, we basically won a piece. Now black has his own move here, forking this, the e2 pawn and the b3 pawn, and because of that he wins a pawn back, but he doesn't win much more back, and we keep our piece. So we can conclude that queen takes bishop on d5 is the strongest move because of the knight fork. Alright, so of course when you decide to do a move like that, you always want to do a blunder check, and so you'll have to visualize taking the queen, or you have to visualize taking the bishop with the end line of queen takes queen, and you want to make sure that the knight fork results in you winning back the queen. Alright, moving on to position 4. In position 4 here, it is black to move, and you can see that there's quite a lot of contact between the pieces and threats going around. So, see, in simple positions, it can be easy to just forget a thought process, to forget being thorough. But the reason you want to do it when it's simple is so that when you're in a complicated position, as your skill gets bigger and bigger, you want to have good instincts and good habits in order to deconstruct more complicated positions. And so this is a beginning example of that. And what you want to do, again, is divide the board looking on your opponent's half, and you want to go through each piece to quickly find the candidates, and then look for all the checks, captures, and threats to deconstruct the position and find the strongest line. So it's black to move, and I'll give you a minute here. Okay, so in this position, you can see that there's quite a lot of contact between the pieces, and you can see that white is threatening the queen, the knight, and so if you're looking for candidate moves, you can quickly discount any king moves. There's no move for the bishop. There's really no move for the rook. We have to figure out, or this rook either, we have to figure out how to deal with the threats on the queen and the knight. So, and since they're on the opponent's territory, on the opponent's half of the board going forward, what we want to do is we want to look for all the checks, captures, and threats. So with the queen, we have capture of the rook, we have the capture of the knight as well, and well, I guess you could say that capture of the pawn is a possibility, but that's easy to discount. It just gives away the queen for no reason. We can move back and threaten the bishop, but for example, if the rook takes, we could take the bishop, but that is not good because you're simply moving the queen back, and it doesn't really lead to anything because the opponent can just bring the pawn forward. So we're pretty much left with any knight move here doesn't work as well. We're pretty much left with queen takes rook or queen takes knight. We can see that queen takes knight doesn't work because black would just simply take the queen back, and now this knight fork doesn't work because the rook would take. So if we take the rook, the only other move is knight takes queen, and now there's no knight to defend this square, and so we do get the knight fork. And so you can see at this point, we're basically an exchange ahead with weak pawns, and the computer's evaluating this as minus 2.9, so it's definitely winning for black. And so you can see, even though there's a lot of contact between the pieces, we could easily and thoroughly deconstruct the position using the described thought process. All right, moving on to the last position. All right, so for position 5, the last position, you want to look for all the attacking moves, the checks, captures, and threats, and then analyze the line till the end. And I'll give you a second here, so it's black to move. All right, so in this position, you could see that there's, well, it looks like white is trying to penetrate into black's territory, but there's multiple moves that black has that attack white. So one of them is moving the knight back and hitting here, which implies another knight fork, so it would be like this. Moving here, hitting the rook, and then a knight fork hitting the undefended rook as well as the undefended bishop. And because of that threat, it forces white to either give up the exchange or to lose a bishop. The other moves, the other candidates, well, there's really none in this position. Black could bring his knight here, but white could simply just defend that square against a knight fork. And black can't bring his rook here because the bishop is controlling the b file. So the only move pretty much is for black to threaten the knight fork. Now if white moves back, then the knight fork is happening. And if he wants to keep this bishop, he'll have to move it, and then black has won the exchange. And so the best course of action would be to simply just move his rook back and give up the exchange. So because of the implied knight fork on d3 between white's rook and his bishop, because his bishop was undefended, he wins the exchange. And that's a very common thing in games where you'll have an implied knight fork that doesn't actually happen, but because of it, you can win material. Alright, thanks for watching. This has been day 2 of 28 Days to Better Chess Tactics. The next one, day 3, will be back rank combinations. If you like this video, then just hit the like button, leave a comment, and let me know. I know there was some issues with sound in the previous videos, but I think I've been able to fix it. I think the mixer was off, but anyway, just let me know what you think, and if there's any topics or specific motifs you'd like covered or have any questions, then just let me know. Alright, have a good day. Bye-bye.